One of the best things that I ever decided to do in my life was to fail quickly. And I think with podcasting, there is a line in which you need to draw underneath a project or pivot with a project in order to move on. And I think that what's really nice about podcasting in general is compared to other mediums, it's a relatively low cost of entry.
Welcome to PodBiz, the money behind the mic, where we get into the business of podcasting. I'm Norma Jean Belenky, a podcast and media strategist.
And I'm John Kiernan. I'm a podcast producer, and we're asking the question that's on everyone's mind. Where is the money in podcasting?
Each week, we talk with podcast industry professionals, marketers, and creators who are turning podcasts into a thriving business and making the industry what it is today.
With real revenue, real strategies, and real results.
If you're looking to grow or scale your show, and of course monetize, you're in the right place.
So let's get down to PodBiz.
Today we're speaking with Alice Florence Orr, staff writer and managing editor of Podcast Review and BBC Radio contributor for podcasting. We'll be speaking about common pitfalls people make when pitching their podcast, the different facets for independent creators in terms of promotion, and how there's still a space for audio-only podcasts. Let's get down to PodBiz. Alice, welcome to PodBiz.
I'm delighted. Thank you so much for having me.
Right out of the gate, the question we ask everybody, where is the money in podcasting?
Goodness. My guess would be in selling IP or selling to a bigger network. That's what I think. Becoming a Netflix show, or getting signed to Sirius or one of these bigger networks. It's probably, if you want $1 million, that's the way to do it.
But there are other ways to do it. And with Podcast Review, leveraging the power of audience is something that you help creators do.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we've been doing recently is really putting a focus on people who are trying to still do independent podcasting. I think as the industry was growing, especially in the UK, there was such an excitement about the fact that people were finally taking this seriously as an exciting, expanding medium that I think we, at least for us, we were kind of getting a little bit razzle-dazzled by some of the networks. And I think we put too much focus on that for a long time. So recently we've been trying to really reconnect with what independent podcasting actually looks like now. And it's been fascinating because I think when people think of independence, they think of, the kind of Michael Hobbs format of, a Patreon, infrequent episodes, a really engaged fan base, something like that. So obviously he was on You're Wrong About, but then he also does Maintenance Phase and If Books Could Kill. And I feel like when I talk to independents, they're like, oh, that's the model I want to replicate. And it's really not the only one. I feel like people can make, really sustainable incomes through a mixture of ads and subscriptions. Like it doesn't have to be this kind of no ad format. And I've seen a lot of really interesting, smaller networks appearing who are interested in creating that kind of sustainable revenue for people who this isn't their full-time job. They're not professional hosts or professional producers and things like that. And then on the flip side, there's also this kind of emerging area of branded podcasting. So people linking up with brands or charities. And we get a lot of press through about those kinds of things too. So it's a fascinating space. And I think that just because I feel like if you want to make $1 million, you got to sell your podcast to whatever. That doesn't mean that that's the only way to have a career in this industry. I think it's a really accessible industry where you can kind of make of it what you want.
Yeah, if we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Like if you want that buyout, sure, like that's the way to go. But also there are so many ways to do that. Subscriptions are the thing that everybody's talking about in terms of sustainable revenue. And Podcast Review is a newsletter where people can sponsor or pitch their podcast to be sent out to over 50,000 people. And there's a lot of really powerful people on that list as well. So when we're talking about how to make money in podcasting, it's not just like, okay, you're either like the 1 in a billion, right? Or 1 in 4 million. I guess there's 4 million active podcasts. So, 1 in several that gets, this $100 million payout, or you really do the work in step by step and you create community and you do the press yourself, or you work with people that are engaged in getting your podcast out there to new audiences. And that's really what you're an expert in and what Podcast Review does.
Absolutely. I think Podcast Review really started to grow when we focused in on talking about and reviewing sort of genres and taking a temperature of certain categories of podcasts. So whether that be true crime podcasts or even something more niche, like I'm currently writing a list about like the best podcasts to listen to on a road trip and things like that, like really understanding how people consume this type of content and also the way in which people identify with it, right? So there are some people who only listen to health and wellness podcasts because that is their lifestyle, that is what they want to do. And it's about understanding like, okay, so if I'm going to make a recommendation to that person, what kind of things are they looking for? Even if I personally am not that kind of consumer of this type of content. And so while I was doing that, I realized that this is actually very similar to, I guess, what's happening in books. Like I've just started dipping into this sort of romantasy genre after studying English lit and being, very content with
Coming
reading.
from a highbrow background.
I know.
You're now eating at the McDonald's of literature. Yeah.
Pretty much. But I feel like a lot of, from what I've seen, a lot of people in my position, start reading fantasy because it is so propulsive. And I think when you are, this is a side note, but if you are busy
Always.
and you're constantly writing and, you have a job, something propulsive and character driven is actually really fun sometimes. I still read, bits and pieces, but so I felt like trying to understand how those communities were being built on things like TikTok and online. And I was like, well, this is exactly how people need to reposition the idea of, podcasting, especially podcasting within their niche. I think that one of the things that has been really interesting to see is the way in which everybody is trying to market themselves as if they're the next Diary of a CEO, when that format is really probably not going to work for like a true crime show necessarily, or, a show that's more comedy or whatever. Like I feel like skits are more interesting. But then separating that out from like not just having like an audiogram, if that makes sense, like doing skits to support the marketing of your comedy podcast rather than just putting your comedy podcast onto Instagram. I think it's like been very interesting to, and as a media strategist yourself, see how people are navigating that.
Absolutely.
And it's not just like a cut and paste thing. It's not just put your clip on and like see what happens. So it's been really interesting to see a lot of people from any stage of that, whether it's a big network or an independent, really try and grapple with these new forms of marketing and make money from their podcast. I mean, what's really exciting about being a reviewer is, yes, I get my regular press releases coming in. And sometimes I'll ask my network, I'll be like, what's coming out, et cetera, et cetera. But I do find podcasts on Instagram. It is true. But they tend to be podcasts that are algorithmically pushed to me, right? So if I'm trying to research a genre that's like best science podcasts, I'm not probably going to find that on Instagram because it's just not, my algorithm isn't formed that way. So I'll end up on Reddit or I'll end up on the forums and things like that. And I think if you reverse engineer that as somebody who's trying to market something, figuring out where your audience lives, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, whatever, you'll find your people a lot faster. And it doesn't have to be loads of people. That's the thing. Like you can have a really successful podcast with only like a few hundred dedicated listeners. And I think that's what's, especially subscription-based ones. I think, if you have people who are passionate about your content, you can break even or, make a small profit. I think it's really possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's such an important thing. I talk about this with clients. I talk about this, here on PodBiz and the industry in general. You want to be where your audience is and you want to talk to them the way they want to hear you. Whether it's, repurposing a popular TikTok sound, whether it's creating reels that are algorithmically specific to your audience and your genre. I think it's super important. Thanks for joining us here on PodBiz. If you're liking the show, please subscribe and write us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other podcast pros find the show. Thanks so much. And back to PodBiz. I want to ask you next, because you get pitched a lot, right? So what are you seeing in terms of how people are pitching for genres, and what are some common pitfalls that creators face when they pitch, apart from like the generic press release of like, I don't know podcast review, I'm sending this to anywhere I can possibly promote my podcast. Apart from that, what are some of the maybe common pitfalls you see about pitches that you see where you're like, oh, I can't even, like, what am I going to do with this?
It's a great question. And I wish more people asked me this, honestly. So I'll try and keep this brief into only like a few different points. The first thing I would say is pay attention to our publishing schedule, or it doesn't matter if it's us or somebody else, pay attention to the publishing schedule because, for example, every month we publish 3 new podcasts to listen to in that given month. And we usually publish it around the 3rd or the 4th. Ours just went up yesterday. And I'd already sent that to sent that to press, published it, everything like that. It was just about to go out in the newsletter. And then I got an email from, somebody that's in my network says, I've just launched this new podcast. you want to? And I'm like, well, unfortunately, like that's just missed the boat completely. And, you know, it may still be relevant in a month's time, but, you know, we do try and only promote things that are new that month. So I think being aware of the publishing cadence and aware that, you know, we tend to be working reasonably last minute. You know, we publish 2 days before we put things out in the newsletter. Just being aware of that would be really helpful, because we do read press releases, especially for things like promoting new shows, and also understanding that we update our main articles, the ones that are very SEO optimized. We update those every year. So if you see, oh gosh, you know, she's already written about best AI podcasts, so I, you know, what am I going to do? Just look at when that date was republished, extrapolate forward a year, and send it to me like a month before I'm due to update that. And I'm way more likely to have that in the back of my mind. I really need press releases because it is quite hard to find a reliable source of fresh information about what podcasts are coming out, what podcasts are coming back. I can't rely on the apps like Spotify and Apple. Like, they are curated and they're very slanted towards certain directions. So for example, like I, being in Britain, get a very different selection than, you know, the publisher Jag, who's based in the US. So we end up listening to very different things if we were just relying on the app. So I think it's just being aware that, you know, we do need that information, but we need it in like a kind of specific, timely way. Otherwise, it's kind of useless to us. A lot of it is just about, is your podcast good? But it's also the luck of, was it on my desk at the moment that I needed it? The second thing I would say is, like, if you are sending a press release and you're like, how do I make sure that this is the one that gets included? I would say what I look for is putting yourself in the mindset of the listener. I am not somebody who is trying to woo the industry, so to speak. So although it's very important for me to call out accomplished producers when I need to, or if it's somebody who is well known and has done multiple podcasts, like you know, Michael Hobbs or Leon Neyfakh, or, you know, somebody who's quite, you know, well known in the industry, I will mention those names and I will put those in the review. But the truth is I want to understand straight away what the listener is going to get from this show. Are there comparable shows? What genre is it? What time of day is this person going to listen to this show? You know, that kind of thing. How long is it? Like, how many episodes in a season? Is it seasonal? Is it weekly? That kind of information is really useful, rather than just having like a list of everybody who made it and like credits and everything like that, which is great. And I think that obviously you need to credit where credit is due, but I need other information that I can very quickly then translate out into, you know, an audience that's looking for more recommendations, like book recommendations, like we just talked about. Like, how would you describe a book? You wouldn't list the name of the agent and the name of the person that you know, corrected the copy and things like that. Or at least you wouldn't do that first. So I think, how do you actually sell this, and sell it to me, and then I can sell it to my readers? And I wish people would do that more. Also, please include your image, your cover art.
Your cover art.
Yes, please. And if you can, if it's not out yet, please also include that as a high quality attachment, because then we can pre-schedule something. A lot of the time people be like, oh, this is embargoed and yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, okay, well, I can't create any assets in advance. So, you know, I can't include this in the article that I wanted to. You can share, you know, pre-episodes with me. If it is embargoed, that's absolutely fine. I do listen to them. But at the same time, that doesn't sway me one way or the other. If I'm interested, I'll probably request an episode, but you don't need to go to the trouble of just including that anyway. I think that's just about it. It's a long list.
That's quite a lot.
I know.
Well, no, it's important. And I think there is such a big PR aspect to podcasting, right? Because we're dealing with a medium of independent creators. And so when we're talking about independent creators, right, we're talking about media that promotes those independent creators, and you still have to go about it in a professional way. So if you hire a PR podcast agency, which there are a few, we've had some guests here on the show that are in podcast PR, or if you do it yourself, you still have to think like, okay, how do I most professionally get this out there? How do I look at, you know, maybe this is a newsletter that's put together, but there's people from the New York Times on your newsletter, right? So if they like your podcast, you never know, you know, where the dots are going to connect. And so how do you be as professional about it as possible? How do you do your research? You know, what are the dates the newsletter or the publication comes out? Who's their audience? How do you pitch to them promoting your show where it's not just, like you said, like a list of credits? The overarching theme that I've noticed recently on PodBiz, talking to people all over the industry, is to be in that spirit of service. Right. So whether you're a podcaster, the audience is who you're serving, right? If you're a podcast hosting provider, the podcaster is who you're serving. If you're a podcaster and you want your show promoted, the publication is who you're serving. And then the publication is serving the audience again. It's just so important to put yourself in the mindset of who's reading this? Why are they going to care about it? How do I make it as easy for them and as interesting for them as possible?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's also just introducing yourself and building that network, because this industry is full of really helpful, nice people helping each other out in, in that same spirit. And I think if you are really at a loss as to how to, get something in front of a reviewer, just send them a message or comment on one of their posts or something like that. Just, not like, hi, can you review my show? But, introduce yourself, introduce your project. As long as it's kind of in the back of the mind, it will stay there. I promise you. It's not one of those things where I read it and forget. It is genuine. I think what people don't realize is that I'm actually, most of the time, I'm struggling to find podcasts rather than the other way around. And there are certain times of the year where there's a huge glut, and that's fantastic, but it tends to be quite seldom. And I think often the hunger is for like, what's the next series and what's the next, it tends not to be the next celebrity fronted podcast. I'm just going to throw it out there. That tends not to be where there's a lack. It tends to be on these really creative projects, things that are more exciting. So if you've got something like that, please throw it at me. And please do not comment on one of my lists and say, oh, you forgot my podcast. Because I just can't. That does happen, and I just can't deal with it. I mean, I'm open to criticism, and I'm open to.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, it's just like you didn't do your research, you didn't submit. How are you supposed to know? So
it's. Yes, yeah, exactly. Because I mean, I think we get into a tumultuous territory at Podcast Review where we, Jack and I have spoken about this so many times, but saying something is the best, the best music podcasts or whatever. It's totally subjective. Most of it is to just sort of game the algorithm. We've tried experimenting with changing it to our favorite podcasts or whatever, but honestly, it still riles people up. And I just wanted to say it is totally subjective. It does tend to be like what I had listened to in that particular month. And so if your show didn't make the list, it may not be because it's bad. It may be because I just couldn't find it. And that's why podcast discovery is very important.
Discoverability is a huge deal in terms of audience development and what I talk to my clients about. It's not a singular faceted issue, right? And you have to be consistent and you have to be cohesive and your brand has to be good across all those facets, right? That's really important. I also loved what you said in terms of different podcast directories, or for anybody listening, the apps, different podcast apps have their own priorities, right? Of what they're going to push you. And so discoverability can be an issue. Because also, how many times have you or I both opened the app we listen to podcasts on, and you're like, oh God, there's nothing I want to listen to, but you're subscribed to like 80 podcasts, and you're like, oh, all the time. It happens to me daily, to be honest.
I actually can't subscribe to that many because I never listen to them because I have to do so much research.
And it just clogs your feed. Yeah.
I listen to so many podcasts every week, and I probably listen to like 3 regularly, and they're all news podcasts because I need to catch up. Yeah,
same.
It's really sad, actually.
I feel like I'm so basic. Well, I think also because when you listen to podcasts for a living or when you work in the industry and you have that, mindset of analyzing the media that you're listening to, it's not always relaxing. And so it's important to have those shows where it's like, okay, this is information. I'm here for information, right? Whether it's, New York Times headlines or whatever it is. I do love a news podcast. And also, I think living outside of your home country, it's helpful to kind of just have your finger on the pulse of what's going on as well.
100%. I only listened to podcasts when I lived abroad. They're amazing. That's probably how I mostly got it. This was before I started writing for podcast reviews. So yeah.
Well, this is my next question. How did you get into the podcasting industry?
That is something I still wonder, to be honest. So, I mean, I kind of fell in love with podcasting because when I got to university, I felt very underprepared. I came from a sort of slightly disadvantaged school in Scotland, and I got into university and I was like, wow, this person beside me has read every single thing in, Eliot's of. I don't know what to do because I haven't read anything. And I felt really, very kind of self-conscious about my understanding of a lot of things in the world. And so I kind of ended up listening to podcasts. And that was the thing that got me into it, is I would just literally search for the name of an artist or the name of a writer or a genre. And like there would be 5 or 6 podcasts that would be talking about this particular subject. So I was like listening to a lot of podcasts at that point. And then Jack, who was also on a year abroad at the same university I was at, we were introduced through a friend of a friend. And then 6 months later, he got in touch with me and said, "Hey, Alice, I have started this podcast review website. Are you interested in writing something?" So I purely did it freelance. I think my first review was, I think it was about The Dream, or it might have been Over My Dead Body. One of these kinds of, yeah, it was either that show or The Dream. I love The Dream, and I've been following it for a really long time. And it was great fun. I realized that I could apply a lot of the skills that I had been developing in uni and apply them to podcasting. And Jack was such a great editor because he was like, yeah, that would maybe make sense in a seminar, but nobody cares about that. So let's just cut that bit and cut that bit. And over time, I started writing more and more for them, ended up becoming a staff writer. And then we started branching into, listicles, these kind of, which is probably like the bread and butter of podcast review, to be perfectly honest. So these kind of mini reviews within a listicle, sort of genre comprehensive overview. And so I loved doing them so much that I actually came off writing reviews, and now I only do the listicles. And I became list editor, and then recently in the last 6 months I became managing editor as Jack moved on to do other things. So he's still the publisher and still very much kind of the strategic mind behind, the direction of the website and things like that. But in terms of the daily executions, I would say it's probably a 80-20 split in terms of the daily operations. It's been a real learning curve, but I've really enjoyed it. And I can't believe that it's almost coming up for, I think, 7 years I've been doing this now.
Wow.
I know. And as I say, as somebody who wasn't in the industry at all, and now it's slightly more affiliated with podcasting, and, I do a little bit of media strategy as well, and, have experimented with my own podcast. All I can say is that it's incredibly friendly. It's also incredibly hard work. It's an incredibly difficult thing to get right. And I'm really in awe of any and all podcasters that, make something sustainably. So Jack wants me to be more mean in my reviews, but I think I'm becoming too soft, honestly.
Oh, and how did you start working for BBC Radio as well?
Oh, that's such a great question. I don't know how. I have a theory about this, but I think the genesis of it was that I wrote an article about the best British podcasts right at the time when British podcasting was becoming really popular. Before that, it was just whatever the BBC was repurposing. Do you know what I mean? So it was a really blurred line in the UK between radio and podcasting. It wasn't so distinct. And I got a call from somebody about 2.5 years ago, asking if I wanted to go on BBC 5 Live and talk about the best podcasts of the year. I did my makeup for this. I think that was a sign that I was maybe slightly over prepared, but obviously it was just a phone call. And I don't know how if anybody's ever been on the radio before, but you literally just dial in. It's not like a podcast where you record video. But I'd done my makeup and I was sitting there and I was so excited, and it was fine. I managed to almost libel somebody. I think I was actually doing a little explainer about if books could kill. And I was like, yeah, and it's about, self-help books that are rubbish, And then I started naming some of them, and the interview was like, allegedly. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. This is not my podcast. It was quite an intense experience, I must say. But I didn't learn my lesson, because later on, a local network got in touch and said, do you want to start doing this as a regular feature? And I did that for a year. And now I just sort of contribute on a sort of ad hoc basis, because it's quite, you're only on for 5 minutes, but my God, you're nervous beforehand.
I think all podcasters feel that way in terms of recording, but we know we can stop, we can edit. Shout out to John for that. For anybody who's come on the show, I'll just scream John when we're going to edit. But there's that stage fright element when you're talking about radio as well. What's one key move or metric or even mindset that's made the biggest impact on your career in podcasting?
One of the best things that I ever decided to do in my life was to fail quickly. And I think with podcasting, there is a line in which you need to draw underneath a project or pivot with a project in order to move on. And I think that what's really nice about podcasting in general is that compared to other mediums, it's a relatively low cost of entry, right? So hopefully you haven't invested too much into something before you know that it's wrong. I mean, I come from a background where I've worked for a lot of startups. I also write novels, so I know how much work goes into, these kinds of massive projects before you even know if you've got an agent and things like that. So what I liked about podcasting is you kind of can just buy a $50 microphone, sit down and with like a $20 software and give it a go. And I think that if it's not working or it's really feeling unnatural or it's not the right fit, I think that this sort of medium really encourages that fast failing in a way that, if you're burning through somebody else's VC money, it doesn't really have that same flexibility. So what I like to see is people doing multiple projects and trying out loads of different things. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Like I see, Meghan Markle doing a new podcast every year or something like that. And I just think that is like an example of how that's not probably a good idea because you're wasting so much money in the process. I think that with podcasting, there is that ability to still start from, a very conservative financial standpoint and then build and then build and then build. And you'll know instinctively if you're at the stage where you're ready to invest and you're ready to scale. But I think unlike TV or anything like that, it's not something that has these huge overheads and you can actually make something really cool on a very small budget. And I am really happy to say that like that's still something that is possible ever since I, started really trying to track down some new independent podcasts. And there's just so much creativity out there. But definitely in terms of everything I've tried, whether it's radio contributing, writing, different segments we've done for Pod Review, et cetera, if it ain't working and you don't feel like it's a fit, maybe you should just move on and try something else because there's always something else going on.
That's good advice. People have started to talk about a little bit more recently about when it's okay to end your podcast.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Not all podcasts have to go on forever. So I think that that's a great point. What's something that people don't know about what you do?
So in the background, I also do sort of podcast media strategy and SEO and things like that. My background is in, as I say, I used to work for startups. I used to do marketing and merchandising, which then became marketing and SEO. And now it's just like content strategy. And I think the real synthesis was when I realized that a lot of the stuff I was doing for these different startups that I had really no passion for, I could apply to podcasting, especially, on these kind of emerging platforms like LinkedIn and stuff like that. So I've been playing around with that for a few years and it's been really fun. So I
love your LinkedIn posts. I'm a big fan. I always follow, I always like them and do the little celebrate hand clap. They're super fun.
I appreciate it.
You're a very fun follow on LinkedIn. What are you excited about coming up in the podcasting industry?
Again, these are fantastic questions. So I know we've been through a lot. I feel like since the pandemic, there was a real boon. And then obviously there were all the layoffs and all the Gimlet nonsense and Spotify, laying off a bunch of people. And I think everybody felt really disillusioned for a long time. And I feel like video is just kind of coming in and being a bit of a distraction to kind of take us away from what is the actual problem, which is that we're not really reaching out to the next generation and encouraging them to be fans of audio. I think when you think about people who love audio, it tends to be the sort of rarefied New Yorker reading, cosmopolitan type, or, somebody who just loves true crime and they like put it in their ears. And it tends to be maybe like I don't imagine a Gen Z person doing this. Like Gen Z, for some reason, has been sort of captured by video. And so we're just trying to make video to, I don't know, appease or get the crumbs from, these video platforms that have invested billions of dollars into turning people into video consumers, right? And I just think that my experience growing up and how I ended up getting into podcasting is that there's so much scope for just really believing in an audio first medium. And I think there's innovation there. I think, and that doesn't mean going backwards. I think it means understanding what is so good about podcasting and what is so good about, audio and radio and all of these kinds of, listener first mediums. And then working out how to really help the next generation understand the benefits of that. And I do wonder if it will come with, somewhat of the kind of social media backlash that people are starting to experience, this sense that they need to go out and touch grass a bit more. I wonder if podcasting will be there to kind of take those people by the hand and really take them into something that is sort of, lower on the nervous system, a little bit more in depth. It is kind of one of the things I love about podcasting is that it's long form. It's longer discussions. It's not just clickbait with, 30-second opinions. And you really have to talk and understand your topic. Otherwise, you'll very quickly run out of things to say. So I hope that it will kind of become this real antidote to some of the, I don't know, gimmicky, clickbaity, and kind of, I don't know, provocative, I guess, media that we're currently being, especially younger people, are being kind of saturated with. And I just would really love for somebody to like take a stand up and create something that will really pioneer that.
Mm. Yeah, for better or for worse, video is the buzz right now. Well, Alice Florence Orr, it has been a pleasure to have you on PodBiz. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Norma. I've had a great time.